Good evening, I am Ibrahim Sani and this is Market Talk. The Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, or IDEAS, last week organized a meeting with the OECD to discuss corporate governance issues of state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. Co-organized by the Malaysian Directors Academy, or MINDA, the meeting is an annual activity of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. The meeting brings together 45 representatives from 13 countries in Asia, which comprises of government bodies responsible for SOE oversight and monitoring. And while companies like Khazanah, EPF, QAP, PNB, Sime and more do take on a corporate structure, the question is the case can be made that they are too SOEs by the broad definition of that term. Joining me are two distinguished gentlemen, the chairman of OECD Working Party for State and Ownership and Privatization Practices, Mr. Lars Erik Fredriksson, and the Chairman, and the CEO of IDEAS, one Saiful, one Jan. Of course, no stranger to the House of Astro. Awani, welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit more about the event that took place last week, the meeting on this affairs of improving corporate governance for the SOEs. Before we jump into that, let's understand the definition of SOEs as per the economic textbooks.
Well, an SOE is a state-controlled entity which is performing economic activities. So it's basically selling goods or services in the market.
Okay, Lars, Erik, if we use that term and that definition, what kind of entities in this country you would immediately identify as an SOE?
Well, joint stock companies, limited liability companies, state corporation, anything that's an legal entity separate from the state and which the state controls in some way.
Now, of course, OECD has a very tough measure in terms of trying to improve standards on improving the corporate governance aspect. In fact, this year's theme is called Managing Risk and Promoting Business Integrity in SOEs. And this is where I want to draw some context. One, Saiful, if you could just give us some argument on why what we normally deem as GLCs and GLICs, can they be considered an SOE in this country?
Well, I think you rightly pointed out there, based on Lars Erik's definition just now, the term that we use more frequently in Malaysia is actually government-linked companies and government-linked investment companies. There are 7 GLICs, government-linked investment companies, that we have, including the likes of Khazanah, Permodalan Nasional Berhad, PNB, Minister of Finance Incorporated, Lembaga Tabung Haji, and several others. So 7 of them, the GLICs, and then there are the GLCs that are owned by these GLICs. So our universe of state-owned enterprises is actually a very large one, because the list just now is simply the companies that are owned by the federal government. Almost every single state governments in Malaysia have their own state-owned enterprises as well. And I think, jumping very quickly to maybe one thing that we need to improve is the fact that we don't really have a proper database of these companies. We don't really know how many there are and who they are.
And of course, the problem is even compounded because all these entities practically operate under various statutes. Tabung Haji has their own law. All these state-owned bodies have their own state laws. And while we worry that we don't have enough database to actually observe all these various SOEs, we also have no way to regulate them in a uniformed manner, because the only thing that we can see something of the lowest common denominator is perhaps the Companies Act. But of course, these entities that you just mentioned just now, they operate in various laws. Well, how do you think we can find a way to see and observe that we can better improve the SOEs in Malaysia, considering that this is a landscape?
Well, I'm sure Lars Erik can bring in more of the international example, but I think in the context of Malaysia, you're right that many of them are governed by Companies Act. But if they're listed, then they're regulated by the Stock Exchange, Securities Commission, and so on. But overall, we don't really have a regulator that governs state-owned enterprises. There are various different statutes that form the backbone of the GLICs, but the GLCs are completely a different story altogether. So this is something that we need to work on, I think. I think there needs to be an improvement. But interestingly enough, in the car just now coming here, Lars, Erik and I, we were talking about whether the governance structure should be centralized or decentralized. Both have their merits and have their weaknesses as well.
Let's talk about that then, because hailing from the great social democratic country of Sweden, I would have assumed that there would be plenty of SOE models to benchmark with, but none more so than those in the Scandinavian countries. Could you bring us an international perspective into how things are done overseas and perhaps what best practices that we can learn and apply here in Malaysia?
Often the Nordic countries are considered as being good practices, good examples. And in the Nordic countries, the state ownership has been centralized, and this is also something that the OECD recommends, centralizing state ownership in order to have an efficient state ownership. You could do that, or at least you could centralize the coordination of the SOEs, the issuance of guidelines or the monitoring of the SOEs. For instance, the board nomination processes, and professionalize these processes.
The theme of this year's conversation, the meeting that happened last week, is on managing risk, and I presume that risk mitigation should be on the top agenda for not just for SOEs, basically for any other entities that handles a lot of public interest, public money, public stake, a lot of people are involved. How do you think we fare, Malaysia, against other international countries that would have the same amount of SOEs managing that kind of wealth that, for instance, Malaysia has?
Well, I know way too little about the Malaysian landscape, but from what I hear, you have a huge portfolio of SOEs, according to the OECD definition. And having said that, it seems to be that quite a lot of assets are under state control, and the OECD recommendations, if they should give one, would probably be to create an efficient ownership structure for these SOEs.
Right, we'll take a short break, but when we come back, we'll discuss more on how to improve SOEs in Malaysia and beyond. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani, and you're watching Market Talk. Today we're talking about corporate governance on the state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. And of course, the theme for this year is on managing risk and promoting business integrity. Saiful, one of the sessions that was discussed last week in the meeting was on the recent developments in state ownership practices in Malaysia. Could you bring us some idea into the recent developments that we have seen in this country?
Yeah, in the meeting last week, we had a very good session discussing about the latest development in Malaysia. And, but we're very lucky to receive support from the government in the form of the Deputy Minister of Finance actually coming to open the speech and giving us a very broad overview of what the situation is in the country. And then we had representative from Khazanah as well as from Minda talking about, the more detailed picture about Malaysia. Of course, we need to acknowledge the fact that there are challenges. Any country would have those challenges. But the thing that we always forget is we have done a lot to improve the situation. During the time of the premiership of Tun Abdullah Badawi, there was a Putrajaya committee on the transformation of GLCs that was set up. And that committee finished their work in 10 years, in 2015, so they started in 2005. And they successfully transformed 20 companies into profit-making companies, contributing to the wealth of the country. So we shared those experiences with the international audience at the OECD meeting, and I think we had a very good conversation.
The discussion that took place, what would be the key lessons that we can derive from the meeting? It took over 2 days, am I correct?
Well, 1.5, but yes.
All right. So last, Erik, if there were 2 or 3 key things that we can learn from that meeting, what would it be?
I think what you can take away, a key lesson learned, is to ensure that you have a well-functioning risk management structure in the SOEs. And it's partly a matter for the owner to ensure that these structures for internal control, for instance, are in place, that you have a well-functioning internal external audit, for instance, which is also key if you want to have a good risk management structure. Other key lessons learned would be the necessity to have a good disclosure, to actually publicize, inform the stakeholders, the public, on how is the company doing, how is an SOE doing. Often SOEs are not always that transparent, but being transparent, publishing your annual reports, for instance, publishing key data on the company, it's key.
Of course, these are the aspirational behavior that we want the SOEs to exhibit, but how do we impose upon these good business values and practices on these SOEs? I'm not just talking about in Malaysia, but elsewhere around the globe as well. How do you envision the stakeholders, the people, the government, the opposition party, anybody who is involved in this, how do you see them imposing the will of the good governance of SOEs onto these SOEs for better practices, better reporting and so on?
Well, the fish rots from the head often, so you have to ensure that you have professional boards in place who know their roles, ensuring that you have an open, transparent company. You have the board of directors responsible for setting the strategy of the company, for the firing and hiring of the CEO. I think so you have to start from the top.
There has been this conversation that is taking place by an academic here in Malaysia. He argues that the SOEs are quite over-leveraged. There's a big case, an economic case, backed by objective numbers, saying that the SOEs in Malaysia are rather stretched. And when that happens, good governance is going to be a big problem. How do you see this? Is this an accurate depiction of what things are right now?
Well, I think we need to go on case-by-case basis here. Some of the companies are stretched, you know, and let's not hide behind the bush. There are some state-owned enterprises that we have that are in serious trouble. You know, companies like 1MDB, for example. We had a long debate about FGV as well. These are state-owned enterprises, and the government is tackling those problems, and rightfully so. But there are some that are well governed. There are many that are well governed, in fact. So the sharing of the experiences between these different companies, I think, is really important. And you know, I just want to add another line just now on your question to Lars Erik as well. I think it's really important to have meetings like this, like the OECD meeting, where representatives from different governments can share their experiences, the ups and downs of reforming the state-owned enterprise sector, and just learn from each other in a very non-confrontational way. You know, there are things that I've done right, these are those things. There are things that I've done wrong, how can you help me? I think those exchanges are really important.
That is the aspired notion that we want to achieve, but the reason why there has been some hesitancy, and not just in Malaysia, elsewhere around the world as well, and Lars Erik, you rightly pointed out, SOEs have a tendency to not disclose and provide a clear and transparent way for the public to understand their reports. And while we want to have proper hiring and firing, proper board management, proper oversight, and many other things that are aspirational, the question remains, is the SOE model even functional? Because some corporates are far more efficient in trying to derive value for their shareholders. Do you think that the time for us to model a big entity out of the GLCs/GLICs, the days are numbered, particularly in Malaysia? What do you think?
Well, the OECD doesn't really take a stand on whether you should privatize or not. The OECD takes a stand that you can actually manage SOEs efficiently, but that's if you want to manage SOEs efficiently, you need to have a professional owner, you need to have a professional board and professional management, and a legal framework so that the board can actually do what the board should do, have the oversight of the company, decide on the strategy of the company, and as I said, appoint or fire the CEO. If this legal framework isn't in place, then you might be right. Perhaps there shouldn't be SOEs in this legal context.
Yeah, if I can add something on that one too. My position on this is twofold. Number one, I think less government in business is better. That is, that is a principle held by the government as well. In the new economic model, our government clearly says that reducing the government's role in business is one of the targets, a key target of the new economic model. So less involvement is better. Let the private sector drive economic growth of Malaysia. So that's my position, number one. But number two, while we have the state-owned enterprise sector, I think it's really important that they are governed well. The reality is state-owned enterprises will always exist. They have existed for a long time. It's a matter of size, whether a smaller sector or bigger sector. So while they exist, the governance must be assured.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we'll talk more about the pension funds because that's a big factor in this discussion as well. But that comes after this. Don't go anywhere. Watching Market Talk, I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. And of course, the conversation today is on state-owned enterprises. I have with me the chairman of the OECD Working Party on State Ownership and Privatization Practices, a mouthful I know, Mr. Lars, Erik, Fredriksson, and the CEO of Ideas, One Saiful, One Jan. And just before we left off, the conversation was hinged upon perhaps we need to have less involvement from the government in the business, and maybe the government can perhaps earn in terms of revenue, in terms of taxation from these companies. And in Malaysia, the two big entities that we can think of, Khazanah and also EPF, they are quite different but similar in nature. One is a sovereign wealth fund, the other one is a pension fund. But I can easily argue that they are rather closely linked in the terms of SOEs. If we look at the, and we haven't spoken about Petronas just yet, so if you look at Norway, perhaps the largest pension fund in the world, if not the second biggest after Japan, it was modeled out of a former petroleum company. Now it's a pension fund, and it's deriving a lot of value for the shareholders there. And because of the intrinsic nature of it having a good governance system with good supervisory abilities, you would see that entity doing well because of the clear transparency notion that it has. Can that model be exported here in Malaysia? And perhaps, if EPF and Co-op are doing well, can they do better using such similar models here?
Possibly. I would say possibly. The Norwegian Petroleum Fund is basically an asset manager managing small shareholdings in different listed companies. Apart from that, it also owns a lot of bonds, real estate, whatever. It's the largest shareholder in the world, basically, owning 1.7% of all listed companies in the world. But it owns small shares. Many other asset managers, such as so-called sovereign wealth funds, can own the whole of the company, perhaps 100%, or they are the controlling shareholders. So it's another type of a shareholder. If you're an asset manager, you can buy and sell the shares as it goes. But if you own the whole company, you can't really vote with your feet like an asset manager.
Early on in the interview, we discussed a little bit about perhaps the case on stronger centralized regulation would be better for SOEs.
Yes.
We haven't discussed deregulation or smaller regulations or decentralized regulation on SOEs. Can we understand better this model and see how it can be applied in other countries?
Yes. So centralized, the basic rationale behind centralizing ownership is to professionalize state ownership, to be a professional owner, to ensure that you have functioning processes in place. The more you decentralize, often you would have people responsible for the ownership role, the execution of the ownership role. Perhaps it's just one person in a line ministry, perhaps they have other government tasks. Basically, they don't have the time to execute a professional ownership role. So the rationale is to have it centralized, to have a whole of government approach to state ownership.
Let's zoom in on the local context. Saiful, I duly note that you did point out we have plenty of SOEs which are doing well. And of course, those that aren't doing well, it is actually blown into a mega proportion and quite justified because of the magnitude of the investigations that are taking place, the space that it has taken over in our press, the PAC, Public Accounts Committee in the Parliament. If it goes bad, it goes spectacularly bad. That's what I'm trying to say. Do you think that there is a way for us to improve on the, as you have it here, improving the business integrity and managing the risk better here in Malaysian SOEs?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think I would like to echo what Lars Erik just said about centralization of the regulatory function. I think the weakness that we have here is it's not just decentralized, it's almost unregulated, and maybe the better term is disorganized, but because it's gone to an extent where we don't even know how many SOEs there are and which state in Malaysia actually have state-owned enterprises. I was really impressed in our meeting last week when the representative from Vietnam actually was able to outline in 1990 we have 12,000 companies. In 2020 we want to have like 103. So that's really amazing, being able to know how many companies there are. So this a bit more centralization of the regulatory function, strengthening the government investment companies division in the Treasury, I think would really be helpful to us.
I want to address the elephant in the room. Do you think the situation right now is largely, the system that we have right now is largely because of the political system in place, because of the lack of laws that we have in terms of political financing and many others? Do you think that is the case?
Yeah, I was a member of the National Committee on Political Financing that was formed by the Prime Minister. And one of the issues that we look into is actually whether state-owned enterprises can make political contribution or not. We decided that they shouldn't.
Thank God.
So hopefully that will be legislated soon. So that's the recommendation that we made, because there's a lot of overlaps between political patronage and positions in state-owned enterprises that we have. I think all this need to be rectified. Hopefully it is in the process of being rectified, and with things like the guidelines produced by the OECD on governance of state-owned enterprises really can help if we just jump into the bandwagon rather than trying to reinvent the wheel altogether. There's no need for us to do a detailed study too much. We need to contextualize it, of course, to the local context, but the big framework is already there.
What would be the key adoption values that OECD wants to impart to us, the regular listeners out there and audience who watch this interview?
I think for Malaysia there is probably quite a lot of gains to be had. The OECD guidelines, what they address is the different roles of the shareholder, the state as a shareholder, the board of directors and management. And by implementing a well-functioning corporate governance system, you will have well-functioning SOEs paying out large dividends to the state budget, and then the government can, through the state budget, allocate these incomes as it wishes. Mm-hmm. But you separate the roles. If the roles of government and SOEs are intermingled, you'll probably have difficulties in the governance structure.
Lars, Erik, thanks for joining me. Saiful, thanks again. I've been speaking to the chairman of the OECD Working Party of State Ownership and Privatization Practices, Mr. Lars Erik Fredriksson, and I've been also speaking to the CEO of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, or IDEAS, Saiful Wanjan. That wraps up this episode of Market Talk. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 5011awani. Don't forget to download our app on the Google Play and the Apple App Store. I'm Ibrahim Sani. Thanks for watching and goodbye.